Welcome to today's deep dive. If you tried to breathe the air inside a commercial airplane while standing at sea level, you would actually likely pass out within minutes.
Yeah, you really would.
And today, we're going to look at why the airlines are legally allowed to just, well, keep that a secret from you.
It completely shatters that comforting illusion we all have when we board a flight, doesn't it? I mean, you settle into your seat, sip a ginger ale, watch a movie.
Right, and you feel completely isolated from the elements.
Exactly. You feel totally safe. The engineering of a modern airliner is just, it's so incredibly good that it tricks your brain into thinking you are just sitting in a slightly cramped, maybe noisy living
So
room.
yeah, you completely forget that you're hurtling through the stratosphere at 500 miles an hour. And the environment just outside that window is fundamentally hostile to human life.
We really rely on a psychological safety blanket. We like to believe that because the climate-controlled environment inside the tube feels stable, well, our biology inside that environment must also be perfectly stable.
But that illusion falls apart the moment you look closely at the physics of what is actually happening to the human body inside that cabin. So we have a very specific mission for you today.
We really do. We're pulling from a massive stack of sources here.
Yeah, peer-reviewed aerospace medicine journals, cardiovascular case studies, and some incredibly dense federal aviation legal precedents.
That's a lot of material.
It is, but we're using it to unpack an invisible, static law of physics that affects millions of air travelers every single year.
We're basically getting into the intersection of aerospace medicine and corporate legal liability. It is, well, it's essentially a perfect storm where physics meets biology and then just collides head-on with the law.
And this is a topic that has gained a massive amount of urgency in the public eye recently. You might have seen the headlines regarding the sudden passing of Senator Lindsey Graham.
Right, yeah.
He suffered a fatal cardiac event shortly after completing a long international flight returning from Kiev. And just to be clear, we are simply reporting the factual timeline of the flight here. The public headline, the thing everyone reads on their newsfeed, it just says sudden cardiac arrest.
Which, I mean, medically speaking, is an accurate description of the final mechanism, but how professionals view that exact same event is entirely different from the general public.
How so?
Well, while most people see a sudden, completely unpredictable tragedy, professionals who work in cardiology or aerospace medicine, they look at that specific timeline.
The major cardiac event immediately following a long-haul flight.
Exactly. They
Yeah.
look at that and they recognize a very well-known, completely invisible stressor at play.
We're talking about the profound effect of cabin pressure altitude on the aging cardiovascular system. So I want to unpack this from the ground up because there's a massive misconception that I think most people, myself included, before we start digging into these medical journals, hold about flying.
Oh, absolutely.
The assumption usually goes like this, right? We all know the air we breathe on Earth is about 21% oxygen. And we know that commercial planes are pressurized.
Right.
So the logic is, if the air is 21% oxygen everywhere and the cabin is sealed and pressurized, flying at 35,000 feet really shouldn't matter to your lungs at all.
That assumption is incredibly common, and it is also, quite frankly, incredibly misleading. To understand how a routine commercial flight can act as a physiological trigger for a cardiac event, we have to break down the actual physics of cabin pressurization.
Right.
Because what the public thinks of as pressurized is actually a massive engineering compromise.
Because they don't pressurize the cabin all the way to sea level, do they? I mean, if they did, I imagine the plane would just burst like a balloon at that altitude.
Yeah, the structural stress on the aircraft fuselage would be immense.
Hmm.
To build a plane strong enough to hold sea level pressure at 35,000 feet, the aluminum and composite materials would have to be incredibly thick.
Making the plane way too heavy to fly efficiently.
Exactly. So decades ago, the aviation industry created what is known as the 8,000-foot compromise. When your plane is cruising at 35,000 feet, the environment inside the cabin is artificially pressurized to simulate being at an altitude of about 8,000 feet above sea level.
So just physically sitting in your seat, you are essentially hanging out near the peak of a high mountain.
Pretty much, yeah.
What does that actually mean for the air we're breathing in that cabin?
Well, the chemical composition of the air does indeed remain 21% oxygen. That part of the public misconception is actually true.
Okay.
But the issue isn't the percentage of oxygen. The issue is the barometric pressure. Down at sea level, the sheer weight of the Earth's atmosphere pushing down on us creates a barometric pressure of about 760 millimeters of mercury.
Okay, 760.
Right. But up at a cabin altitude of 8,000 feet, you lose a massive amount of that atmospheric weight. The pressure plummets down to about 565 millimeters of mercury.
I see. So the oxygen molecules they're still in the cabin, but because there's less atmospheric pressure squeezing them together, they are spread much, much farther apart.
That is the crux of the physics. Because the molecules are spread so thin, what medical professionals call the partial pressure of inspired oxygen drops dramatically.
Wow.
And this leads us to a physiological process called the alveolar cascade. You see, getting oxygen into your mouth and nose is only step one.
Right, it has to get into the blood.
Exactly. By the time that thinner air travels down your trachea, reaches the tiny air sacs deep in your lungs called alveoli, and mixes with the moisture and carbon dioxide already sitting in your respiratory system.
You lose the pressure.
Yes, you lose the physical driving pressure required to push that oxygen across the alveolar capillary membrane and into your bloodstream.
Okay, I really want to make sure you're visualizing this with us because this is the critical aha moment from the research. Think about trying to pull a shot of espresso, but your expensive machine suddenly has terrible water pressure.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
You have the hot water, which that represents the oxygen in the air, and you have the tightly packed coffee grounds in the portafilter.
Those would be the tiny membranes in your lungs.
Exactly. So both essential ingredients are present, but without the physical, mechanical driving pressure from the machine's pump to force that water through those tightly packed grounds, you just cannot get the espresso into the cup.
Right. Doesn't matter how much water you pour on top.
Exactly. Without pressure, you can't get the oxygen into the bloodstream. It just sits there, unable to cross the barrier.
That is a phenomenal way to picture it. The ingredients are in the room, but the physics just aren't cooperating. Because of that lack of driving pressure, pushing the oxygen across the membrane, functionally speaking, sitting in that pressurized cabin is the exact physiological equivalent of standing at sea level, but breathing air that only has 15% oxygen instead of 21.
15%. I mean, that is a staggering drop in functional oxygen.
It really is.
And that immediately raises a massive red flag for me. If the functional oxygen drops that significantly for every single person on the plane, why isn't every single passenger just passing out in the aisles?
Well, this is where the static laws of physics collide with human biology. We have to look at how different bodies react to that 15% equivalent environment. And the primary variable that changes the equation is the human aging process.
So we're looking at youth versus age. If I take a healthy 25-year-old and put them in that environment, what happens?
Their body compensates almost instantly. A 25-year-old might feel a little lethargic. Maybe they develop a mild dehydration headache or feel a bit fatigued after a 6-hour flight.
Sure, just standard travel fatigue.
Right, but their cardiovascular system easily handles the adjustment. But for passengers in their 70s or older, the biological math changes drastically. And the medical journals point to two specific, colliding age-related factors that create a very unique vulnerability.
Let me guess the first one, because it seems somewhat intuitive. Just through the natural wear and tear of living for 7 decades, the lungs themselves must degrade, right? Like, they just aren't as efficient at sea level, let alone at 8,000 feet.
That is absolutely correct. It is a baseline drop. As we age, there are natural, unavoidable changes in our lung architecture. The lung tissue loses some of its elastic recoil and the actual surface area of the alveoli.
Those tiny sacs where gas exchange happens?
Exactly. That surface area decreases slightly over time. This means that a senior citizen already has a lower baseline level of oxygen in their arteries, even when they are sitting safely at sea level in their living room.
So they're starting the flight with a much smaller buffer. They're already closer to the edge of the cliff before the plane even pushes back from the gate.
Yes, their margin for error is significantly reduced. But the first factor alone isn't what causes the catastrophic events. It is the second factor that really sets the trap.
And this is the part of the research that genuinely shocked me when we were putting this deep dive together. It is what the aerospace medicine journals call the body's broken alarm.
Yeah, it's a very apt term.
Can we dig into the hypoxic ventilatory response? Because I always assumed that if my oxygen dropped, my brain would immediately panic and force me to breathe heavier.
It's a fascinating piece of our evolutionary biology. The hypoxic ventilatory response is your body's internal automatic alarm system for oxygen deprivation.
Okay.
You have specialized sensors, known as chemoreceptors, located primarily in your carotid arteries in your neck and in your aorta near your heart. Their entire biological purpose is to constantly taste your blood and monitor the oxygen levels.
And if it drops?
If the oxygen drops below a certain threshold, these sensors just scream at your brainstem, commanding it to breathe faster and breathe deeper to pull in more air.
Which is why if you try to hold your breath underwater, you eventually get that overwhelming, panic, burning urge to gasp. You can't fight it.
Exactly. Your brain overrides your conscious control to save your life. But in seniors, the clinical research shows that this specific alarm system becomes dangerously blunted.
Wow.
As we age, the physical sensitivity of those chemoreceptors degrades. It is kind of like having a smoke detector in your house with a dying battery. The smoke is filling the room, but the alarm is only letting out a faint chirp instead of a piercing siren.
That's terrifying.
In some individuals over the age of 70, this hypoxic ventilatory response can be blunted by up to 50%.
A 50% reduction in the alarm system. That is incredible. So let's put this all together for the listener. You have an older passenger sitting on a 9-hour flight to Europe. The physics of the cabin's lack of driving pressure are drastically lowering the oxygen getting across their lung membrane, dropping it down to the equivalent of 15%.
Right.
They already have a lower baseline of oxygen due to their aging lungs, but because of this broken alarm, this blunted chemoreceptor response, their brain doesn't even realize there is a massive physiological crisis happening.
That is the truly chilling part of this mechanism. The body simply does not aggressively fight back to correct the deficit. The older passenger doesn't start hyperventilating. They don't feel breathless or panicked.
They just sit there.
Yeah, they just sit there, maybe watching an in-flight movie, maybe dozing off. And the clinical result is that their blood oxygen saturation can easily and silently slide down into the high 80s during a long flight.
Let's put that number in perspective for you. If you were lying in a hospital bed at sea level and your blood oxygen saturation silently dropped into the high 80s, well, bells and whistles would be going off and a team of nurses would be rushing into your room with a supplemental oxygen mask.
It would warrant an immediate, aggressive clinical intervention, without question. But on an airplane, that exact same biological state is just a standard Tuesday.
Which brings us to the most critical link in this chain. If the lungs are physically failing to deliver enough oxygen to the blood because of the cabin pressure, and the brain isn't sounding the alarm to breathe harder to fix it,
The rest of the body still needs oxygen to survive.
right, the biological burden has to go somewhere. Who picks up the slack?
The burden is passed immediately and heavily to the heart. And this is exactly where the static physics of the cabin turn into a potentially lethal trigger.
Because the brain, the kidneys, the liver, they all still need their baseline level of oxygen to stay alive. If the blood contains less oxygen per drop, I imagine the only way to deliver the required total amount of oxygen to the vital organs is to just deliver more drops of blood.
You hit the nail on the head. The heart has to work overtime to compensate for the lungs. It drastically increases what we call cardiac output.
How does it do that?
It achieves this in two ways. First, by pumping faster, which increases your heart rate. And second, by pumping harder, squeezing with more force to increase the stroke volume with every single beat.
Now that sounds like an amazing redundant backup system, assuming your heart is in pristine condition. But we aren't talking about 25-year-olds. What happens when we introduce coronary artery disease into this high-stress equation?
This is the absolute crux of the medical issue. When we look at older demographics, specifically travelers in their 70s and 80s, we are dealing with a very high prevalence of fixed coronary artery disease.
And what's terrifying is that this disease can be completely subclinical.
Yes.
Meaning the patient has absolutely no idea they have it. They walk around their neighborhood, they carry their groceries, they pass a standard physical, and they feel completely fine.
Exactly. They have zero daily symptoms.
Yeah.
But they have structural stenoses, which are physical narrowings in the coronary arteries caused by decades of gradual plaque buildup.
This feels like the ultimate physiological supply and demand crisis. Let me map this out and see if I have the mechanism right. At sea level, a person with narrowed arteries is totally fine. They have just enough blood flow squeezing through those narrowed, plaque-filled pipes to supply their own heart muscle with the oxygen it needs to beat at a calm, resting rate.
Their biological supply perfectly meets their biological demand.
But then you put them at an 8,000-foot cabin pressure, the oxygen in their blood tanks. The heart is forced to work significantly harder, beating faster and pumping with much more force to save the brain.
Right.
But because the heart is working so intensely, the heart muscle itself suddenly demands a massive increase in oxygen. It needs more fuel to run the engine, and it is demanding this massive increase in fuel at the exact biological moment that the available oxygen supply has completely bottomed out due to the cabin pressure.
It is the perfect physiological trap. The heart is screaming for oxygen that it simply cannot get. The narrowed pipes prevent enough blood from reaching the working heart muscle.
Wow.
This severe supply-demand mismatch pushes the passenger over what we call the ischemic threshold. Ischemia is just the medical term for the severe restriction of blood supply to tissues.
And what actually happens inside the heart when you cross that threshold?
The results can be catastrophic. The severe stress and localized lack of oxygen can completely destabilize the cardiovascular system. The mechanical stress of the heart pumping so hard can trigger a previously stable plaque in the artery to suddenly rupture.
And then what?
When plaque ruptures, the body instantly forms a clot to heal it, which blocks the artery completely. That is an acute myocardial infarction, a classic heart attack,
Oh, wow.
or alternatively, the localized lack of oxygen in the heart tissue can disrupt the heart's delicate electrical system, sparking a sudden, fatal arrhythmia. The heart loses its rhythm, fibrillates, and stops pumping blood entirely.
Which brings us all the way back to the headlines we see, like the timeline of Senator Graham's passing. The public sees sudden cardiac arrest.
Right.
But when we trace the breadcrumbs back through the aerospace medicine journals, we see this incredible, invisible cascade of physics and biology. The pressure drop, the alveolar cascade, the broken alarm, the overworked heart, that all led right up to that critical moment.
It is a profoundly well-documented medical reality. The mechanisms are not mysteries, they are foundational concepts in aerospace medicine.
Which naturally forces us to ask the multi-billion-dollar question of this deep dive. If this is unknown, heavily documented medical reality, if we empirically know that putting a 75-year-old with subclinical heart disease into an 8,000-foot pressure environment can trigger a fatal ischemic event, why aren't airlines mandated to warn vulnerable passengers before they board the plane?
That is where we leave the realm of medical science and step onto the highly complex, heavily guarded legal minefield of commercial aviation.
Seriously, why isn't there a giant red warning label on my ticket when I purchase it? We have warnings on disposable coffee cups telling us the coffee is hot. Why doesn't the airline checkout page say, "Warning, if you are over 70 or have a heart condition, the physics of this flight could trigger a myocardial infarction"?
It comes down to how airlines are classified under the law and how federal courts have historically interpreted the concept of risk and liability. Airlines are legally classified as common carriers.
Okay, common carriers.
Right. In tort law, a common carrier has a very high, strict duty of care to safely transport their passengers from point A to point B. However, over decades of litigation, courts have consistently ruled that the high-altitude pressure changes inside a commercial aircraft fall under a legal doctrine called the assumption of common knowledge.
The assumption of common knowledge. That legal phrasing implies that every single person walking onto a plane inherently understands the partial pressure of oxygen, the alveolar cascade, and their own subclinical ischemic thresholds.
Legally speaking, yes, that is exactly how it is treated. The courts view the drop in barometric pressure at altitude the exact same way they view the existence of gravity. It is a static universal law of physics.
I see.
The law requires common carriers to warn passengers about operational anomalies, things that deviate from the expected standard of the journey. If there is severe, clear air turbulence ahead, the pilot is legally required to turn on the seatbelt sign. If an engine fails, there are strict emergency protocols they must follow. But the law does not force them to warn you about the standard, unchanging laws of physics that apply to the environment you voluntarily chose to enter.
I see. It would be like trying to sue a ski resort because you fell down and got hurt, claiming they didn't warn you that the mountain was steep. The steepness is the fundamental nature of the mountain. The low pressure is the fundamental nature of flying.
That is a perfect legal analogy.
Yeah.
The courts say you assume the baseline risk of the environment.
But let's play devil's advocate here for a second.
Yeah.
From a purely practical operational standpoint, imagine if airlines did suddenly try to mandate age-based medical warnings or tried to screen people. Imagine the absolute friction at the airport.
Oh, it would be catastrophic for their entire business model.
Yeah.
The logistics would be completely impossible.
If Delta or United started flagging every single person over the age of 70 at the boarding gate, pulling them aside and asking them to provide medical documentation proving they don't have coronary artery disease before letting them down the jet bridge, the lawsuits would be astronomical.
They absolutely would be. First, you'd be looking at massive class action lawsuits for age discrimination and violations of medical privacy. Second, you're introducing a concept called gate liability.
What's that?
If a gate agent, who has no medical training whatsoever, reviews a doctor's note and decides to let a vulnerable passenger fly, and that passenger then suffers a fatal heart attack halfway over the Atlantic Ocean, the airline has now explicitly taken on the medical liability of that decision.
Wow.
They stepped out of their protected role as a mere transportation company, and they acted as a medical clearinghouse.
So by saying absolutely nothing, they legally protect themselves.
Precisely. The Federal Aviation Administration and the Department of Transportation essentially passed the buck entirely to the patient-physician relationship. The airline industry's staunch, legally protected position is that screening for cardiovascular disease is a medical duty that belongs in a doctor's office, not an airline workflow at gate B12.
So from a legal perspective, the actual act of purchasing the airline ticket, clicking that little buy now button on the website, is you effectively certifying to the airline that you are medically fit to endure the physical environment of that flight.
Yes, the liability is almost entirely shifted off of the corporation and onto the consumer.
Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway for you listening to this deep dive right now. Because if the legal system isn't going to protect you, and the airlines are financially and legally disincentivized from warning you about this risk, it completely comes down to personal advocacy. What stands out to you as the solution here?
Knowledge really is the only defense. If you are in your 70s, or if you have a vulnerable loved one who travels, parents, grandparents, there are very specific, actionable solutions to mitigate this risk, but they require you to take the initiative.
Let's outline those solutions. Where do we start?
First, a pre-flight cardiovascular check is essential for older travelers. Do not rely on the assumption that because you feel fine at sea level, you will be fine at 8,000 feet.
Right.
A cardiologist can run a chemical stress test to see exactly how your heart responds to a simulated increase in demand. They can spot that subclinical CAD before you ever step foot on a plane. Second, and this is the most practical mechanical solution, look into an FAA-approved portable oxygen concentrator, or POC.
Oh, these are those small battery-powered devices you sometimes see people carrying through the airport that look almost like a little thermos or a small briefcase, right?
Yeah, exactly.
How do they actually solve the physics problem we've been talking about?
They are incredibly clever devices. You do need a doctor's prescription for them, and you have to jump through some logistical hoops, like notifying the airline in advance and ensuring you have enough battery life for the flight. But a POC works by taking the ambient thin air in the pressurized cabin, chemically filtering out the nitrogen, and delivering highly concentrated oxygen directly into your nose through a cannula.
Ah, I see. So instead of breathing air that is 21% oxygen at a low pressure, you are breathing air that is maybe 90% oxygen at a low pressure.
You're manually overriding the environment.
You are artificially bumping that oxygen percentage way up to mathematically compensate for the lack of driving pressure in your lungs.
Exactly. It restores the supply side to the physiological equation.
Yeah.
Even with the lower pressure, the sheer volume of oxygen molecules you are inhaling ensures enough crosses the membrane into your blood so your heart never has to panic and work overtime. It is practically the only way to individually beat the 8,000-foot compromise.
Which brings us right back to where we started this conversation. That familiar feeling of sitting in the cabin, sipping your drink, feeling perfectly safe and isolated in that climate-controlled tube. We really love the illusion that our modern conveniences in engineering have conquered nature.
We do. But the truth is, the immutable laws of physics are still entirely in charge, right on the other side of that thin aluminum wall.
The environment remains hostile, and our biology simply hasn't evolved fast enough to keep up with our engineering.
No, it hasn't.
It really leaves you with something profound to think about the next time you're booking a flight or helping a parent book theirs. Because if the simple, routine act of buying an airline ticket legally binds you to the assumption of common knowledge regarding these invisible, incredibly complex physical stressors on your body,
Right.
what other hidden biological tolls are we unknowingly consenting to every single time we quickly scroll to the bottom and click agree on a modern terms and conditions page?
That is a fascinating and frankly unsettling question about modern life and corporate liability.
Definitely something to mull over the next time you're waiting in line at the boarding gate. Stay curious, stay informed, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.